Hello and thank you for joining us for the first in our three-part Get Ready for EPA series. This series of short webinars has been designed for apprentices who are approaching Gateway and ready to take their endpoint assessment. And the first workshop will focus on the perfect portfolio. So this is the portfolio of evidence that you're required to gather to present to the independent endpoint assessor to showcase the work that you've been involved in that addresses the knowledge, skills and behaviours that form your apprenticeship. So the webinar will be delivered by myself. I'm Jake Tween, Director of Apprenticeships with DSW, and I'm accompanied by my colleague Alison Lyon, who is our Head of Apprenticeships. So DSW is a leading endpoint assessment organisation in the apprenticeship space. We have over 25 years experience. We endpoint assess 37 different apprenticeship standards across different occupations and sectors, and we work with over 200 providers and 2,500 employers delivering endpoint assessment. So in this workshop, we'll cover the purpose of the portfolio. We'll talk about what to include in your portfolio of evidence. We'll talk about when you should begin to gather evidence to put in your portfolio. And we'll share with you some top tips on how to present the best version of the portfolio and how to prepare you for the endpoint assessment and activity on the day. And we'll also talk about the support that's available to you from DSW and from your training provider.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about the purpose of the portfolio. So portfolio is made up of a range of materials and documents that are generated over the period of the apprenticeship, and they provide evidence of the apprentice's ability to apply and demonstrate the knowledge, skills and behaviours that they've acquired during that time. So each apprenticeship standard is made up of knowledge, skills and behaviour statements. And as I said, the portfolio will enable you to provide evidence and showcase how you've demonstrated those knowledge, skills and behaviours. The evidence that you include in your portfolio will be in the form of real live examples of things that you've done and completed within your role and within your workplace. So your portfolio will showcase the work that you've done, so it needs to be made up of the best examples that you've got that demonstrate your knowledge, skills and behaviours. It provides the background context for those activities, so it tells a story of what you've done, how you've done it, and it will include evidence that proves and validates and corroborates that you have done that activity that you've talked about. So it will form the basis for the interview and discussion. So the assessor will review the evidence and they will determine how that meets the knowledge, skills and behaviours that are being assessed. That will then help them to determine which areas they need to explore in the interview or discussion. So a good quality portfolio leads to a more focused, streamlined interview or discussion. It provides the background, the detail and the context, and that then gets tested in the interview or discussion to ensure that you understand it and that the assessor is able to validate and authenticate and corroborate those examples.
Thanks, Alison. So in the next section, we'll talk about what to include in your portfolio of evidence. So portfolio of evidence should always include a blend of different types of evidence. And we categorise evidence into three different types. So we have anecdotal evidence, we have product evidence, and we have performance evidence. So anecdotal evidence tends to be reflections and accounts that might be verbal accounts that are recorded, or they might be written accounts, which are subjective in nature, but which describe specific activities that you've been involved in during the course of your apprenticeship. So the first example might be a personal statement or a case study that you yourself have written, or indeed you might do an audio recording of that. And the purpose of this really is to set the scene and to describe in detail to the independent assessor the work that you've done and the activities that you've led on and been involved in. And what it does is it helps to set the scene and paint a really clear picture to the assessor. Now, anecdotal evidence on its own isn't sufficient. What you need to do is back it up with the other types of evidence, which we'll talk about shortly, which are product and performance evidence. But it's a good starting point. So we'd always recommend that if you're starting your portfolio, the best place to begin is to write up a written account of something that you've been involved in. And the advice I always give is to think about something that you did that was perhaps challenging or pushed you out of your comfort zone, or where you led on something that was a major piece of work. So you might think about a complaint that you dealt with, or a project that you led on, or a presentation that you delivered to colleagues. And what you'll find is by writing that account and then mapping it to the KSBs, you'll actually end up covering quite a lot of the KSBs with just a single statement or a single case study. And on that, you can then add in the product and the performance evidence to prove that what you've written about is an accurate account. Anecdotal evidence might also include observations from your skills coach. So your skills coach might be known as an on-program tutor. They have different names, but it's essentially the person from your training provider or college or university who has supported you throughout your apprenticeship journey. So who's helped deliver the knowledge, skills and behaviours and is now helping you to prepare for your endpoint assessment. So they might have come into your place of work and they might have observed you carrying out certain tasks, and then they might write up an observation or record an observation, and that can be included in your portfolio of evidence as another piece of anecdotal evidence. And as I mentioned, anecdotal evidence, because it's subjective in nature, it needs to be supported by other types of evidence that prove that what you've written about, what you've talked about, did happen and is an accurate reflection of what you've said. So the second type of evidence that we talk about is product evidence. And this is what we describe as the gold standard. So this is the irrefutable proof. This is the work output that you provided, and it can come in many different forms. So a very common form of product evidence are redacted copies of communication. So typically in a portfolio of evidence, we might see a series of screenshots of email exchanges between you and colleagues or your manager or clients or other stakeholders. And what that does is it backs up what you've written about in that personal statement. So you might have said in your personal statement, for example, I dealt with a really complex complaint. I had to keep the customer informed throughout. I had to operate within our organisational policies and processes, and I had to escalate the issue and retain ownership over it. So that statement is an excellent piece of evidence because it's really clear to the assessor what you did. The type of product evidence that you might put in to support that statement would be copies of the email communications between you and the client, between you and the colleagues who you've worked with to help resolve that issue. And it's important to remember with all evidence, but emails in particular, that you should redact information. And by that we mean take away any information which might disclose personal details that don't need to be disclosed, or might reveal commercially sensitive information that your employer doesn't want to share. So if you want any guidance on redacting your evidence, you can refer to the DSW toolkit, and we have guides around that, but also I would strongly encourage you to speak to your training provider, and they'll be able to check your evidence before you submit it to make sure it's, for example, compliant with GDPR regulations. Another common type of product evidence might be presentations that you've delivered to colleagues or customers, or reports that you've written and submitted to team members or your manager, or it might be the board of directors. And these are work outputs, these are product evidence. So again, this is proving to the assessor that what you've talked about and what you've written about actually happened and took place. Now, a couple of things to note with these examples is it's important to date the evidence so that the assessor can see very clearly when you produced that report or when you delivered that presentation, and so they can make sure that you did it within the acceptable time frame for your apprenticeship. But wherever you've been involved in group work, it's really important that you are clear as to what your specific contribution was and what your involvement was towards that group work. So avoid using terms like we and us, and instead talk about what I did. So typically with things like team meetings or presentations or projects where you've got multiple people involved, just check your evidence before you submit it and make sure that it's really clear to the assessor what you did and what your involvement was in that activity. Project documentation. A lot of us are involved in projects in our day-to-day work, and projects are an excellent source of product evidence. So you might have things like your project initiation document, sort of stakeholder matrices, Gantt charts, anything that you've used to help deliver that project within its specification. That all can count towards product evidence, and it's great if it's backed up with that personal statement to really describe what you did and the way you approached that work. copies of minutes and actions from meetings that you might have attended, or you might have indeed kind of chaired or facilitated those meetings. And again, just make sure you redact anything that doesn't need to be in there, and make sure it's clear what your contribution was to those meetings and those actions. And then finally, evidence of continuous professional development activities you've been involved in. So you might attend events or conferences that are relevant to your role. You might attend internal or external training sessions. And you should always be thinking when you're attending these events, can I include this in my portfolio of evidence? Can I use this to demonstrate to DSW that I'm doing these things routinely day in, day out that allow me to demonstrate those knowledge, skills and behaviours? So wherever you're including things like that, it's often useful to put a note alongside it to say, okay, this is the purpose of the event. This is why I asked to attend, or indeed I was asked to attend. This is what I got out of it. And this is how I shared that information with my colleagues and the wider business to benefit everybody. Now you can start to see when you piece these different types of evidence together, you get that blend that we talked about before, and you end up with a really rich, detailed portfolio of evidence that showcases the best bits of work and the best activities you've been involved in. And so the third and final type of evidence would be what we call performance evidence. And typically this might be the sort of reports that your employer produces anyway. So outside of the scope of your apprenticeship, you might have certain service level agreements or metrics that your performance is measured against. So you might, for example, get a monthly report that shows how you've performed against your SLAs, whether or not you're compliant with your business's expectations, and how you're benchmarked against other people in your organisation that do a similar job. Those types of reports are brilliant bits of evidence to put in your portfolio of evidence. Evidence of any professional awards you've been nominated for, or indeed you might have achieved, or other professional achievements that you've kind of created and achieved through the duration of your apprenticeship programme. Again, with stuff like that, it's really important that you annotate it so it's really clear to the assessor what was the award for, how did you get nominated, what did you do to kind of gain that particular achievement. Redacted appraisal and performance review documentation is another great source of evidence. So most of us will have kind of formal or informal appraisals or one-to-one meetings. So you might have an annual kind of formal review. You might have a more casual monthly meeting with your line manager. The reports and the outputs from those, again, can be really useful to put in your portfolio of evidence to demonstrate to the assessor how your performance is viewed within your business as well. So it's not just your account of how you're doing, it's also your employer's account and, you know, reports and data and information that demonstrate that level of performance. You might also include feedback you've had from stakeholders. So that's not necessarily just your line manager, it could be colleagues that you work with, people within your team. Really useful to help demonstrate things like behaviours. And that leads us finally on to witness testimonies. So witness testimonies are written or recorded statements that are usually done by your line manager. And what they do is they provide an account of specific activities that you've been involved in. So what we want you to avoid is getting witness testimonies from your line manager that are generic in nature. So for example, you might have a witness testimony that says, okay, Joe Bloggs is brilliant. They turn up for work every day on time. They're very well liked and respected. They're very productive. That's not much use to the endpoint assessor. What the endpoint assessor needs is specificity as to specific things that you've done and that you've achieved and how they link to the knowledge, skills and behaviours that are being assessed. And so my final point on this is when it comes to witness testimonies, what works particularly well is if you ask your line manager to write a witness testimony that aligns to one of the or more of the personal statements that you've written. So if you've written a personal statement about a project you managed, ask your line manager to write a witness statement about that project. And what that does is it makes sure that the witness testimony is specific and it's describing specific activity, but it also gives the independent assessor an extra angle through which to view that performance. So you've written about it and, okay, I think I performed really well and it was great and here's the product evidence to prove it. But you've also then got a witness testimony from your line manager that says, yep, they did, they nailed it, and actually they were really resilient and they came up across a number of obstacles, but they managed to overcome them. And by the way, it didn't get in the way of their day-to-day work. That's exactly the sort of thing that we'd like to see in a witness testimony. So it's specific, it describes specific activities, and it aligns to your own personal statements, and it aligns to the knowledge, the skills, and the behaviours that are being assessed as part of your portfolio in your apprenticeship. So just to recap on that, because there's a lot on that slide, what to include is a good blend of evidence is the most important thing. So don't rely solely on one of those three categories of evidence. Your portfolio should include all of them. So your anecdotal evidence really gives the context in the description. The product and the performance evidence validates and authenticates and corroborates those written or verbal accounts.
Okay, so each of the apprenticeship standards has different rules about the collection period for your portfolio of evidence, and some of them are really specific around things that need to be included in there. So some of them might ask for a journal or a recording of a training session that you've been involved in. So make sure that you get a copy of the DSW toolkit, because that will explain to you what that evidence period looks like, and you'll be then very clear on when those examples need to come from. So get yourself a copy of the toolkit. Make sure you begin gathering your evidence as early as possible. It will get you used to gathering those examples and the supporting evidence, and the more you do it, the more familiar that you will become with those knowledge, skills and behaviour statements and what they mean and what is required. The other thing is, the earlier you start to gather it, the more examples that you'll have. And then when you get to the end and you need to pull everything into your final portfolio, you will then have some really good examples, and you can go through and you can select the best ones, the ones that really do showcase your knowledge, skills and behaviour. So make sure you gather your evidence frequently, so don't leave it all till the end. It's much easier to write a statement about something that's happened straight after it's happened, whilst it's fresh in your mind, whilst you can remember what you did, who was involved, where you can find that evidence to back it up. And obviously you'll have been dealing with other people, so that's the right time then to reach out and to get that witness testimony from somebody, you know, before they forget, before they move on, and then you find that you're not in a position to collect one. Make sure that you check in with your skills coach and show them what you've gathered. Look at the examples with them, run through them together. Your skills coaches are very familiar with those knowledge, skills and behaviour statements, and they'll also be very familiar with something that we call our amplification document. So that's a document that we give to you, and it's within our toolkit, so it's there and available for you, and it explains what that knowledge, skill and behaviour is and what the requirements are. So those statements themselves are often very complex and compound. They're made up of multiple parts. They also contain what we call command verbs, so that will tell you whether you need to demonstrate something, whether you need to evaluate, or whether you need to describe something. They're often made up, as I said, of multiple parts, so you might need to give more than one example of something. So it might ask, for example, for you to deal with an internal customer or an external customer. So make sure you get a copy of that amplification document and look at it, because that really will give you the guidance that you need to understand how to meet the range, the depth, the scope and the breadth of that knowledge, skill and behaviour. So it's a really good idea to rate yourself against the knowledge, skills and behaviours. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be as simple as rating yourself red, amber and green. So, you know, green, I've got some great examples. I feel that I really do meet that criteria. Amber might be where, well, I've got an example, but I'm hoping that I get something a little bit better that really does showcase and demonstrate those skills. And red could be where you've not yet had an opportunity to demonstrate those knowledge, skills and behaviours. I think it's really important that you do that activity and you do it on a regular basis, because if something's red and it continues to be red, it might be that you need to work with your employer to get coverage to that thing. So it might be something like a complaint that doesn't happen very often, so it might be that the next time one crops up, it can be given to you to deal with. So I think it's a really important activity to do, and it ensures that when you get to the end and you have to pull your final portfolio together, you should have examples for all of the knowledge, skills and behaviours that you need to demonstrate. Within our toolkit, we provide documents that will help you map the evidence within your portfolio. So it will list all the knowledge, skills and behaviour statements for you, and it will give you room to show us where that evidence is within your portfolio. There's instructions in there that give you guidance on how to format different folders. What you need to remember is that our assessor needs to pick your portfolio up and they need to navigate around that and find the piece of evidence. It's also important to remember that our assessor has a finite amount of time to do that piece of work, so it's really important that they can easily identify and navigate to the pieces of evidence that you feel meet one of the certain knowledge, skills or behaviours.
Thank you, Alison. So we just wanted to share with you some top tips really to help you present the best version of your portfolio and prepare for your assessment. So covering the entirety of the assessment criteria, so the knowledge, skills and behaviours is the most important tip that Alison and I can give you today. As Alison said, some of those criteria when you read them might be quite complicated and they might actually have 3 or 4 parts to them. So that RAG rating activity is really useful to make sure that you're confident that you understand each of those assessment criteria and that you've got enough evidence to cover them in full. Think big. Your starting point should be thinking about the big projects, the big initiatives, the really tough pieces of work you've done that pushed you out of your comfort zone. From there, you'll find that you end up covering holistically quite a lot of the KSBs, the knowledge, skills and the behaviours. Showcase your best evidence, so don't be tempted to put absolutely everything in your portfolio. You might actually have a huge portfolio that you've been very diligent and you've gathered over time, but before you submit it, refine it down and so make sure that you're showcasing the best evidence and presenting the best professional version of yourself for the assessor. We strongly recommend that you do mock assessments. So your portfolio usually leads to an interview or a professional discussion. So bring a copy of your portfolio with you, sit with your line manager, your skills coach, record the session so you can view it back afterwards as well and appraise your own performance. And use the same equipment, so use the same laptop, be in the same room, the same environment, so you're replicating it as closely as you can to the actual live assessment. Really important that you make sure ahead of the assessment you understand the assessment conditions. So speak to your training provider, refer to the DSW toolkit. And when we talk about assessment conditions, we mean the room that you need to be in, so there's nobody else there unless it's a panel. You're not going to be disturbed by anybody. You don't have anything in the room that might aid or assist you, but that you do have access to the things that you might be permitted to take. So you might be allowed a copy of your portfolio with you. You might be allowed notes, for example. So make sure you're aware of those conditions so you don't get caught out, but also that you can benefit from the resources that are available to you. Make sure that the evidence is attributable to you again. So we see this a lot, and that's why I've mentioned it a couple of times. It's very tempting and very easy to say, we did this, and I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but this is an assessment about you, so you have to tell the assessor what you did and what you achieved. And use real specific examples. So there are very few occasions in an apprenticeship assessment where you should be talking about hypothetical scenarios. The whole purpose of the apprenticeship is to demonstrate that you're capable in the role that you currently do. So in order to determine that, the assessor needs to see real examples of you doing those tasks and doing those duties. So in your portfolio, and then when you talk about examples in your interview and your discussion, use those real specific examples. Don't be generic and don't use hypotheticals. Make sure your evidence is clearly dated, so not the date that you submitted the evidence, but the date of the activity that you're describing. So if you're describing a complaint you dealt with last month, you date that last month, not today. And finally, I just mentioned before, but it's an important point, is refer to the portfolio examples in your interview. A real advantage that you've got here is that you know what's going to be assessed ahead of this discussion, ahead of this interview, because it tells you in the toolkit. So you've got everything that you need to be as prepared as you can be, and you've got those real life examples in your portfolio. So there aren't any trick questions. The assessor isn't trying to catch you out. They want you to pass. They want you to do well. And so they'll be asking you to talk to them about those examples that you put in your portfolio and explaining a little bit more about those.
Okay, so there are lots of support available to you to help you through your endpoint assessment and in particular your portfolio. So I've mentioned several times DSW Toolkit. So make sure you get a copy of that. Your providers have access to it, and it is for sharing with apprentices. So get yourself a copy. Within the toolkit, there's lots of different documents. So things we've mentioned like the amplification and the documents that help you map your portfolio. But the toolkit talks to you about all of the endpoint assessment methods that you'll go through, the time scales for that and how it's going to be carried out. So it's a key document and one that you really do need to look at. We also have a separate guide for portfolios, so that will talk you through the different types of evidence, how to date it, how to redact it. So have a look at that, make yourself familiar with it and use those principles when building your portfolio. So at the end of every assessment, you will be given feedback from the DSW assessor. So that's done in writing and will be shared with you by your skills coach. So have a look at that. Have a look at the feedback. It will help you understand how you've performed and it will give you guidance ready for the next assessment method that you face. So DSW have a YouTube channel, and within that channel we have lots of different resources available. So things like the recording that we're doing today. There's also things on there such as how to build, how to complete a project, how to prepare for interviews. So have a look on that channel. There are some really useful resources and that will help you prepare for your endpoint assessment. We also have a reasonable adjustment and special considerations policy. So if you've had something put in place for you when you were at school or college, or even now in your workplace, then inquire about it, because it may be that we can put a similar adjustment in place for you while you're completing your endpoint assessment. And lastly, we have an appeals process. So if you get your result and you feel that it's not right and you want to question that, then have a chat with your skills coach, because there is a policy and a process in place whereby you can have that result looked at and reconsidered.
Thanks, Alison. So just want to say a huge thank you for taking the time to watch this. We wish you the very best of luck in your endpoint assessment and whatever the future holds for you. So thank you and good luck.